Hello everyone, my name is Onepeg. In today's video, we're going to look at the suit that Nexon has filed against Ironmace Games and Ironmace's now response as of about a handful of hours ago today. Now, this is something that I spoke about on my live stream. It's in the VOD if you guys want to go and check that out. Otherwise, that's why we have this summary video. First, I want to get into the claims that Nexon has made, the responses that Ironmace has made as a result, the files that Nexon says that Ironmace stole, and what Ironmace has in response. Now, I want to be perfectly clear that this isn't going to be an unbiased take. There is a lot in this, and you can call me a dev fanboy all you want. This morning, I was very much in favor of saying, like, well, Nexon probably has a suit here. It really wouldn't have been taken this far if they didn't. But after seeing what I've seen, let's just say that this borders on the line of absolutely frivolous. So if you want a TLDR from this, it's that Nexon looks really bad right now. Before I get into all of this, let me first address a couple of things. The first is there are arguments that will be made that Ironmace is in the wrong here because of the DMCA takedown that was enacted on Steam. I want to first say that if you understood how DMCA works, you would understand that there's a reason why Steam took it down. DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, is designed to protect people from this kind of stuff, from IP theft. The idea being that artists and entities that own rights to certain types of IP, games, music, movies, all of that stuff can't be reproduced and rebroadcast or used to profit people without the consent of people that actually own that IP. That's why you see things like DMCA takedown requests on YouTube all the time and on Twitch for music and in games for stuff like this, for IP theft or supposed IP theft. The reason why organizations like YouTube and like Steam take these things down at the request of people, as long as they're able to show some kind of an amount of evidence, is because if they don't, the platforms, YouTube or in this case Steam, can be held partially liable for leaving it up. These safe harbor provisions exist to protect the platforms that serve them. For instance, if, in this case, Valve were to leave this up and ignore the takedown request and believe it to be frivolous, if only then to have Ironmace be found guilty, Nexon would be able to sue Valve for potentially profiting off of leaving it on the marketplace. Let's say if Ironmace were to push this to early access and start making money off of it, Valve obviously gets a cut. So in this case, they must abide by the DMCA request or they risk them being held liable in part for leaving it up. What I have here in front of me is a copy of the DMCA takedown request from the Office of Arnold and Porter attorneys, the attorney being James S. Blackburn. Now, this, again, was posted in a public Discord, so it's not like I'm doxing anybody. This is the attorney's letter that was sent to Valve stating that Nexon wanted to have this taken down. At the end of this document, it also states something about the safe harbor provision, saying that Valve could be potentially liable, which is, again, why Valve abided by this request. But I want to go into talking about first the timeline, also the allegations, and whether or not I believe that this holds any merit. In the letter, it says that based on their investigation, they believe that Dark and Darker appears to have been built and developed by using trade secrets as well as copyrighted information copied and stolen from Nexon. That's their allegation. That work being done inside of the game, in Ironmace's game, is a carbon copy of work that was done in Nexon's project called P3. Now, there are two differing timelines in this story. The first timeline that Nexon alleges is that a person working for Nexon as the head of the development studio overseeing a team of 20 for Project P3 had been working on this project from home. Now, this project that had been getting worked on from home was being worked on at their home office via a remote link. Now, there are two differing timelines here. They're in direct conflict with each other, but they do have one important material effect. The first timeline that Nexon talks about is this one. Nexon began developing a new first-person shooter role-playing game, also known as the P3 game under the P3 project in August of 2020. For 11 months until July 2021, at least 20 Nexon employees worked exclusively on the P3 project, and Nexon invested more than 1.1 billion won, which is approximately 815,000 USD, to develop the P3 game. During this time, Nexon made significant developments to the P3 game and created unique concepts, genre, plot, storyline, characters, and plans. Nexon also created a large number of proprietary source code, art resources, and build files. So far, everyone is in agreement with this, both Ironmace and the people at Nexon. Then it goes on to say that a person by the name of Ju-Huin Choi, and I'll just call him Mr. Choi, a former Nexon employee and team leader of the P3 project who had access to all the P3 project files, acquired and transferred without authorization more than 11,000 key build files of the P3 project from Nexon server to his personal server in 2020 and 2021. I want everybody to pay close attention to those years. 2020, the year of the COVID pandemic, and 2021, while we were still reeling from the COVID pandemic, and globally, everyone had COVID protocol. Most all of which, if they had the ability to, would work from home. Now, I don't know about you, but there was an awful lot of programmers that were working from home on their games. The response to this is exactly that. Due to a mandatory remote work policy implemented by Nexon in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the accused member received multiple written authorizations from executive members at Nexon from 2020 to 2021, allowing him to utilize an external personal server to improve the performance of his team. Example, version control, build machine, and dedicated server. After utilizing the personal servers for almost a year, the accused member asked the leadership if it was okay to continue using his personal servers. The leaders told him to refrain from using the personal servers. The accused member agreed to take down the servers as long as he could maintain the performance of his team, having his programming team come to the office, bypassing the company-wide remote work policy. So again, Nexon claims that this person had been using their personal computing devices at home to work on Project P3. And had 11,000 files plus worth of evidence to support that this person had been leaking that information to themselves. Meanwhile, he had had permission during 2020 and some of 2021 to do just that. However, they both agree that there was a small period of time, about 2.5 to 3 months, at the beginning of 2021 through about April of 2021, where they did not get express permission. However, were still being ordered to go home and work from home based on COVID lockdowns because of surges in the disease throughout Korea. When the buildings next to his office were shut down due to confirmed cases, he took to a risk and fully set up his personal servers to aid in development. Since all company machines were monitored using a company-wide endpoint solution, the existence and usage of his personal servers, ones that were subject of approvals and reapprovals, must be reasonably known to Nexon over this multi-month period of development. Not a single warning was received from that security team, so it was easy to construe it as acknowledgement that his actions were acceptable. Otherwise, it would mean that Nexon would be failing at taking reasonable measures to maintain the confidentiality of their assets. I will say this, at least, looks relatively suspect. There was a 3-month, roughly, period of time where someone that worked at Nexon, Mr. Choi, worked at Nexon and was working on this from home without expressed permission from the folks at Nexon to allow him to do so. However, because of the COVID pandemic, it's completely reasonable to assume that being as they were potentially unable to go into the office on certain days, but still had deadlines, they wanted to make sure the team was able to perform. Him personally deciding to do so and Nexon deciding that it wasn't okay is completely within Nexon's right. Thus is why Mr. Choi has a lawsuit pending from Nexon against him for this violation of their security protocol. However, during the course of this entire thing, at no point should Ironmace, for this bit at least, be subject to scrutiny. Even though Mr. Choi decided to work for them, even though Ironmace is making a game somewhat similar, I would say, to Project P3, according to what we've seen so far, it doesn't necessarily mean that Ironmace is at fault. It means that Nexon's gripe here is with Mr. Choi, not with Nexon. But I digress, there is more. And remember, we're talking about timeline here, which the differences come up soon. So far, everything is in line from both sides, albeit the reasonings are a little bit different. Upon discovery of his misconduct, Nexon disciplined and terminated Mr. Choi in July of 2021. Mr. Choi approached P3 project members, urging them to leave Nexon and create a game similar to the P3 game outside of Nexon. Additionally, Terrence Park, who is known as Terry, the CEO of Ironmace Games, was a former director of game development at Nexon and the head of a sub-team for P3's project. At Nexon, he worked on the P3 game with Mr. Choi and other Nexon employees who later joined Ironmace. Shortly after Mr. Choi was dismissed from Nexon, Terry Park left Nexon on August 9th, 2021. Less than 2 months after Mr. Park left Nexon, and only 3 months after Mr. Choi left Nexon, Terrence founded Ironmace on October 20th, 2021. They say, based on their timeline, and the way that they have placed this in their letter, is that they found misconduct after this person had been working on this stuff from home. They then decided that they were going to terminate this person in July. In between those two events, it is believed that Nexon scrapped Project P3 because of this leak. That's what they have told the press. After this person was let go, Mr. Choi recruited people from inside of Nexon to come and work with him outside of Nexon, and thus Terry founded Ironmace along with Mr. Choi, who is believed to hold some amount of stock in the company. And this is where the roping in of Ironmace comes into play. We have reason to believe that Mr. Choi stole and misappropriated Nexon's trade secrets and copyrights and used them along with Mr. Park and Ironmace in the development of the counterfeit game Dark and Darker. Moreover, as the founder of Ironmace and former P3 Project team member, Mr. Park knew or should have known that Mr. Choi illegally stole Nexon's trade secrets and copyrighted materials to develop Dark and Darker. Mr. Park and Ironmace thus have knowingly benefited from Mr. Choi's misappropriation and will continue to do so since Dark and Darker is made commercially available. Therefore, the DMCA strike must take place, is basically how the rest of this goes, and then there is proof therein. So the timeline, again, is Mr. Choi was fired, then recruited a bunch of people to come and work at Dark and Darker and used the assets that he had stolen from Nexon to build Dark and Darker's game. Now remember, they're saying that all of this stuff, the files and whatnot that they list in their exhibits, are stolen property from Nexon. Stolen. Now let's talk about the timeline that Ironmace states. The accused member decided to leave Nexon in June 2021 due to a breakdown of trust with one of his superiors and due to the uncertain atmosphere at the company. His prior project was unceremoniously canceled after a well-received milestone presentation in 2020, and numerous other projects around him were also canceled during this time. This is a completely different timeline psychologically. Remember, Nexon says that they scrapped the project after they found the data breach. Ironmace and Mr. Choi are saying a completely different one. Ironmace and Mr. Choi are saying that the project got scrapped. Mr. Choi decided that he was going to leave to pursue this idea that he thought had legs, and in doing so, talked to his coworkers about leaving the company. Then you have the folks over at Nexon, the superiors at Nexon, getting wind of this and terminating him, citing that he stole assets. And I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of corporate jobs in my career, working at different financial firms when I was a financial planner for a little more than 11 years, and came across multiple instances of people that if they even got so much as a sniff of you leaving the company to work for a competitor, they would tell you instantly to pack up all of your stuff and leave. No 2-week notice, no question of whether or not you were going to stay, no searching out whether or not any of this stuff was valid. People in those industries, competitive industries like this, get cold feet and they will just terminate you on the spot. Take your suitcase and get out. This is completely believable to me. Shortly after Nexon's leadership became aware of the accused member's plans to leave the company, instead of trying to resolve it in a professional manner, they abruptly sent the internal audit team and accused him of stealing files, despite having observed his personal server being used without notice for several months. Due to harassment and the lack of respect from the company, and after consulting with his lawyers, he concluded that his private information on his private servers wasn't subject to any record, so he deleted his information to ensure his privacy. Nexon thought that the assets were stolen, but just to make sure that everything was on the up and up, Mr. Choi deleted everything off of his own personal computing devices to make sure that there would be no evidence of wrongdoing whatsoever, which I think is pretty noble, as long as that's true. It makes sense to make sure that there would be no record of any wrongdoing in those cases. You're telling me that I was allowed to work from home. I'm not allowed to work from home anymore. I did for 3 months. My bad. If you're going to sue me over that, that's my fault. But I don't want to rope anybody that I've been working with in on this if we decide to go along and make a game that is somewhat similar in genre. And in doing so, I want to make sure that I'm completely clean and the company that I'm working with is completely clean, so I'm going to delete everything that I have on my end. He was fired based on these unproven claims and subsequently sued by the company a month later, with liens placed on his home and other assets. His personal lawsuit is still ongoing, and the claims of stealing and misappropriating these files have not been substantiated. He has been fully cooperative with the investigation from police and has been the target of multiple search warrants. Ironmace has also been the subject of multiple search warrants during the investigation and has been accommodating as possible to speed up this process and prove no wrongdoing. The fact that 9 of the 20-plus P3 project team members voluntarily left Nexon out of their own free will to join Ironmace, despite the inherent risks of joining a startup, shows the trust that the accused member instills in his peers. I mean, there is some truth to that if you think about it. 9 other guys decided that they were going to leave the project and join this startup that was already being horribly scrutinized for months, and they still came. I mean, it's one thing if you say that one guy's a thief, but to say that 9 other people that didn't go along with the thief originally but then decided to, I don't know, man. If it were me and I figured that they had a leg to stand on, I probably wouldn't have put myself in jeopardy, you know? Some of the rest of this almost reads ridiculous, if I'm being honest. To investigate, Nexon conducted a comparative analysis of Dark and Darker and the P3 game. First, a preliminary analysis revealed that the resource file names of 2,338 files were identical between the two games. Now remember this. There's some numbers here. 2,338 files they found were direct copies, at least in file name. Even if one takes into account that both games were developed using the same program, example, Unreal Engine, the number of identical file names is too substantial for mere coincidence. For your reference, the comparison of the file names is appended hereto as Exhibit D. They didn't say how many of the files were part of Unreal Engine. That's over 1,300 of the 2,338 files. 1,300, more than half. As their first number, 2,338 files, more than half were part of Unreal Engine's core architecture that is needed to be able to just use Unreal Engine. Second, the character designs and other settings and structural designs of Dark and Darker are suspiciously similar to those of P3 game. Both games, this is the part that I love, both games showcase the same character class: Barbarian, Cleric, Fighter, Wizard, Rogue, and Ranger. Furthermore, just as the P3 game takes place in a dungeon with dark brick walls, which is intended to portray a dark and fearful atmosphere, and introduces torch-related game features, which allow users to light up or extinguish the torches installed in the dungeons to increase or decrease visibility, Dark and Darker takes place in the same brick-walled dungeon setting with these same torch-related game features. It is no coincidence that the characters and setting of the games are aesthetically so similar. It is clear that Ironmace used Nexon's data to create the characters and setting in Dark and Darker, even if, as Ironmace has argued in media statements, the graphic assets, including character designs, were purchased from the Unreal Marketplace. It does not explain the numerous specific aspects of the characters in Dark and Darker's characters that are different from that of the graphic assets available for purchase in the Unreal Marketplace, but are identical to the aspects of the characters found in the P3 game. The comparison of characters and setting structural designs between Dark and Darker and the P3 game is appended hereto as Exhibit E. So let's take a look at Exhibits D and E. Oh, and really quickly, by the way, they list a number of copyrights that were filed in the U.S. office. Now, Dark and Darker has been was being worked on since November of 2021. Since then, it has had, 4 public playtests now, with a 5th one that was slated to be in early April. In that time, the most successful playtest that we saw was the second to last playtest that they had, which had 1 million unique accounts, and this last one that they had toward the middle of February that had 2 million unique accounts. Since then, since those playtests took place, Nexon decided that they were going to file a copyright for a whole bunch of assets, the game's code, as well as certain pieces of art that were generated. And you can see here that we have the effective dates of the registration as February 9th of 2023, with the registration decision being approved on March 3rd. It is March 26th. So you're telling me that in all of this time, Nexon's Project P3 that had been generating whatever it had been generating, saying that this was something that was proprietary to Nexon, owned by Nexon, that at no point between when they filed lawsuits and saw all of this going through, at no point did they decide to file for copyright until early 2023 after they saw Dark and Darker start gaining traction? Interesting. So here is the list of files from Exhibit D. Now remember, this says that it's more than 1,000 files having the same file names as Dark and Darker. This is their big smoking gun. And below is the list of resource file names that are identical in Dark and Darker and the P3 game. They're not going into source code. At no point do they mention that anything in here has anything to do with source code or that they found evidence of them having used the source code, but instead they list 1,000 different files of assets. As we scroll through, you can see that is a pretty extensive list. But here's the thing. If you look real close, some of this looks interesting. WY's icon 16, WY's icon 512, WY's .u plugin. For those of you that don't know, a program like WY's is a plugin that you can use for multiple game engines for spatial audio. WY's is a very, very common spatial audio plugin that a lot of developers use in their video games. You see the logo splash on the intro screens for an awful lot of games. A lot of them. Ironmace responded with a Google document spreadsheet showing every single one of the files that Nexon says are the carbon copy of something that was theirs, was proprietary, and is therefore in violation of copyright, with links to where they can be found. Unreal Engine Marketplace. This is a free plugin that you can get from Dmitry Karpukhin, located on his website, dmitrykarpukhin.com. The Blockout Tools plugin is something that anyone can add to Unreal. In addition, it goes down and shows additional links. Unreal Engine Marketplace for the Fantasy Dungeon. What does the Fantasy Dungeon look like? Now that looks awful similar. Those torches look really similar, don't they? So you're going to say that a game that was created using files that were stolen from you were the vast majority of, in fact, they go on to say that 950 of the 1,038 files that are listed in this claim were from the Unreal Marketplace or other associated marketplaces and were obtainable by anyone in the general public. And of course, then there is the question of, well, what if the person that was using those files on his home computer leaked them to the Unreal Engine Marketplace himself? Well, that's easy enough to show. On February 2nd of 2016 was when the Fantasy Dungeon pack was provided to the Unreal Engine Marketplace. You can see it right here, 2/2/2016. Some of these other ones, Fantasy Dungeon 2, 2/16/2021, something that was in there months in advance of whenever the people at Nexon say that their data was stolen. Medieval Armor, 6/20/2019. This looks awful familiar, doesn't it? Let's see. Yeah, I would say that that looks pretty similar to a whole lot of other character models we've seen in Dark and Darker, wouldn't you? It looks pretty much the same. Modular Skeleton Army. Well, here's an interesting photo. This looks like a normal skeleton. And then we have one of the red skellies, the guys that are like moderate level difficulty. And what's this? Oh, the nightmare difficulty ones. That's strange. And then there's other VFX packs, and like I said, WYs, etc. In fact, if we go and we actually scrutinize the entire list, and Ironmace even highlighted this, there are 82 files, according to Nexon and Ironmace, that actually look like they could be scrutinized. Ironmace shows that these are duplicates. There's a U asset and a UEXP file of the same file. So there's actually 41 files that Nexon actually could try to claim was stolen. However, the file names being the same are simply because of standard naming procedures that Ironmace utilizes the recommended UE and GAS naming convention, same file name as P3, but different content and or implementation. For instance, there's a name called GA Crouch or simply Torch. There's another one called Fireball. There's another one called Lockpick. There's another one called Throwing Knife. Now, if it were me, it's kind of hard for me to call a torch something other than Torch. What are you supposed to name the file? Stick with Rag on Fire? And this is why I say, because this is supposed to be the big smoking gun of our assets were stolen, and here's examples of them being stolen. This, to me, looks incredibly weak. Let's talk about character design for a second. Inside of this exhibit, they show the concept art originally for each one of the classes. And then they show the concept art for P3 and the concept art for Dark and Darker, what they've been showing in their concept art as pieces of their own media. showing classes Barbarian, Cleric, Fighter, Wizard, Rogue, and Ranger. Now, sure, it could be argued that Ironmace could have gone in a different direction, chose some different classes. Maybe instead of a Wizard, they made a Sorcerer. But I still feel as though in those cases, let's say, just because they were named differently doesn't mean Nexon wouldn't have tried to do this just as much. Having a different name doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to not file a lawsuit just because you name them something else. Secondarily speaking, the names that they used for these classes are pretty generic. In the case of Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, which is where all of these things come from, there are incredibly common tropes. When you have different fighting classes, you have barbarians, you have clerics, you have wizards, obviously, you have rogues, rangers, and then all of the other sub-archetypes that would come from those classes. These are all basic Dungeons and Dragons characters that have been used in tabletop games right along. In this case, they show that the concept art looks very, very similar to what was being used for Project P3. And Ironmace responds with the following. Our response is that both games rely on very traditional classic fantasy tropes, none of which are original and can be found in numerous other fantasy games, including the listed character classes and the torch mechanics. Both games being in the same genre of a classic fantasy dungeon crawler can explain these similarities. Now, if we look at this, it's kind of hard to argue that they look very similar, right? The art is very, very close. As it turns out, the reason why they look similar to each other is because the concept artist at Ironmace was the concept artist for this game, P3, at Nexon. So if you tell the same artist to draw 10 different drawings of a barbarian, it's probably going to look really close to each other. That's kind of how it works. And as much as you would say, oh, well, they're carbon copies or they look too close or whatever, here's what I would argue. We already have seen that the vast majority of the assets used to generate the game Dark and Darker and Project P3, in the cases of what Nexon already provided to us, were a whole bunch of store-bought assets. We've already seen the armor, we've seen some of the character models, we've seen the skeletons, all of these things that are part of the game. If you have, for instance, a cleric or another class, a barbarian, it's possible that you would have art that was very close to the armor and whatnot that they were wearing, regardless of where it was that you were working at the time. And the same artist drawing the same types of pictures is probably going to make pictures that look pretty similar to each other. It's their artistic style, after all. But to argue that this is the basis for a copyright claim, because the same type of artist, the same artist was asked to draw a wizard a couple of different times for a couple of different studios, doesn't really shout copyright claim, at least not to me. Nexon also claims that certain core mechanics of the gameplay, the ability to walk in darklit hallways and need a torch to be able to see in the dark, or the ability to turn torches on and off, is something indicative of P3's core mechanics, mixed with this ability to extract or having this PvPvE style of gameplay. Now, while that may be a unique take on those types of mechanics or being utilized in this way, while it is similar to Dark and Darker, I would argue this. In 1997, Eidos Interactive published a game called Thief, where you can see him here leaning and shooting a water arrow into a torch. Now, this game was unique at its time. But again, 1997 first-person shooter with the ability to control lighting as to not alert guards. This was something that was relatively pioneering at the time. And I remember this from my own childhood as being something that I thought was really, really cool, where I could control the amount of lighting that was being given off from a source. It is very easy to argue that a game like Dark and Darker with the ability to control torch mechanics like this is something that you would tap into your knowledge of history of games, something that took place over 20 years ago, and me still having remembered this very specific mechanic when I read about Nexon's own argument. If I could remember that, it's not that hard to think that anybody else could. It's also not that hard to be a Dungeons and Dragons nerd and be somebody that plays Tarkov and consider what would Tarkov be like if it was set in a Dungeons and Dragons style of world. What would a game like that look like? Anyone, I would argue, that is into both of those things could think of that concept. So for this reason, or these reasons, I do not believe that Nexon has a strong enough case here. They go on to say, as the final bit of their claim, that Dark and Darker has all characteristics of the P3 game. This genre of game requires users to basically compete with each other as player versus player, but also to fight in an in-game environment, e.g. monsters. So PvPvE. Conceptually, not that big of a thing. We see a lot of PvPvE games. In fact, when they were looking at doing their first playtest, the folks at Dark and Darker marketed themselves to Redditors that use the Tarkov subreddit. Has both FPS and RPG elements. Users cannot defeat other users only with a simple attack and have to aim and shoot other users to defeat them. Moreover, users grow stronger as they obtain various items and go on adventures. FPS and RPG elements associated with games are things that have been celebrated and used in many, many BRs over the years, and a game like Tarkov literally relies on that exact mechanic. The game's starting point, 16 users participate in one game. The game starts from selecting characters at the tavern where a user can communicate with other users. Now, they're talking about like multiple spawn points for other people and starting at a tavern. To have a jumping off point is the same thing that we've seen in plenty of other games as well. Also, the number of players when I have played this playtest have varied anywhere between 12 and 20, because 16 in this case that they're claiming in Ironmace's case had to do with the ability for a server to handle a certain number of players. It had nothing to do with whether or not they wanted it to be a carbon copy or 16 was a good magic number. It had to do with server performance. Character classes, being overlapping, consist of fighter, barbarian, cleric, rogue, wizard, and ranger. Again, this is something that could easily be dismissed as just common tropes from Dungeons and Dragons, which is something that SDF, the creative person behind Dark and Darker, has literally been a nerd of forever. In fact, the next class to come along is the Bard, but I don't see them talking about future plans for Project P3 and whatever the next class was supposed to be. The background setting of both games is a dungeon made up of dark bricks. The games have torch-related features and they offer a fixed attack pattern for each type of weapon. In both games, the user interacts with in-game objects such as boxes and doors available in the form of casting, and certain amounts of time are required to equip or replace equipment. So what they're talking about in this case is that barbarians have the ability to break a door down if they use a certain perk, or wizards have the ability to break a door down or break barrels, etc. with fireballs. Again, the idea of thinking that somebody with a really big burly axe couldn't break down a door, or that a wizard couldn't break apart certain objects with a fireball, doesn't really ring to me as indicative of having stolen an idea. You could say that there are plenty of other games, for instance, Skyrim, where you have the ability to break surfaces with fireballs, or that someone would be able to crawl through a dark dungeon or modify the appearances of lighting through environmental interactions. Now, Nexon's claim is by mixing all of these elements, it is a carbon copy of their game. But again, the only thing that they have to go on are the files that they are claiming that Ironmace stole from them. In this case, though, the files, at the vast majority of which I can see, at least for the 41 that are actually able to be argued because the rest are just market assets, of the 41 that they're showing that could actually be argued, half of them look so generic in name, you can't just go on file name alone. What's the file look like? That's the thing that really matters. You're trying to argue that a concept is something that you can try to lay claim to copyright-wise. And unfortunately, I can't think of a single case in the history of anything having to do with games where the concept is something that you could argue is yours and yours alone. If that were the case, then H1Z1's Battle Royale would be able to go after PUBG, who in turn would be able to go after Fortnite, who in turn would be able to go after any other BR game that has come since. In fact, Warzone, Call of Duty, would have to be in court for probably the last 15 years, given the majority of the stuff that they have done, as would most other shooting games that came anything after like Wolfenstein 3D. Let me be the first to say that if I actually believe that Nexon had a real leg to stand on here, I think that they would have a case. Unfortunately, I don't believe they do. I've looked into everything that these guys have had to say on both sides, and this is extremely weak to me. Now, of course, that doesn't matter when it comes to court. People with money, means, the ability to drag things out as long as they want. If Nexon decides to do that, they have the financial backing to be able to do exactly that. To me, this claim, this lawsuit, reads as though a bunch of corporate guys that decided they were going to abandon a project, they made it abandonware, didn't want someone else working on their project without them trying to get a cut of it once they found out that this project wasn't garbage after all. But again, you can't sue after a concept, especially not a concept that you decided was never going to see the light of day. The last thought that I will leave you is this cheeky little bit of a response from the folks over at Ironmace having to do with the concept being stolen from Nexon. The premise of adventurers delving into dungeons full of monsters and treasures in their quest to seek riches is so generic and common that it can be broadly applied to numerous other fantasy games. So just for fun, we asked ChatGPT to come up with a description for a generic PvP dungeon crawling game that created an eerily similar game description below. Here's a generic game description for a PvP dungeon crawling game. In this PvP dungeon crawling game, players compete against each other in a dangerous and mysterious dungeon filled with traps, puzzles, and monsters. Players choose their characters from a variety of classes, each with unique abilities and playstyles. They must navigate through the dungeon, fight off waves of monsters, and solve puzzles to progress deeper into the dungeon. However, in addition to battling monsters, players must also face off against each other in intense PvP combat. They can attack other players to steal their loot or gain an advantage, but they must also be careful not to get caught off guard by enemy players. Along the way, players will collect loot, weapons, and magical items that will help them in their quest. They can also trade items with other players or buy and sell items from NPC shops. The gameplay involves strategic decision-making as players must decide when to attack other players and when to focus on advancing through the dungeon. They must also manage their resources carefully as they have a limited supply of weapons, spells, and health. The ultimate goal of the game is to reach the deepest level of the dungeon and defeat the final boss, all while outsmarting and defeating other players. This game offers an exciting and competitive experience for players who enjoy both PvE and PvP gameplay. And yet, Nexon will say that that idea is somehow proprietary. Anyway, guys, that's the story. Thanks so much for coming and checking it out. For more stories like this one in and around survival and extraction genre games, please consider subbing the channel here. It really does matter. And if you'd like to see me live, I'm live over at twitch.tv/onepeg every day around 7 to 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.